Hello and welcome to another edition of Spotlight on Politics. I'm your host, Al Sypek, and with me today I have a special guest, Republican running for Congress in the 1st Congressional District. Let me introduce you to Eddie Edwards.
Hi,
Eddie,
Al.
nice to have you on the show.
Great to be on your show.
Good.
Great to be here.
So I know this may sound a little boring, but I'll first ask you, because you've said it a million times, talk a little about your background and why you want to run for Congress.
Absolutely. Happy to do so. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been in New Hampshire for 32 years. A little over 32 years. And growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, my childhood was challenging, like unfortunately a lot of our young people. I faced a home where there was domestic violence, drug abuse, drug use, and bear witness to my mother being beaten on a regular basis by my father. Older brother who kind of followed my father's footsteps, who decided to get into drug dealing himself. First time went to prison for 8 years, second time for murder, actually, 18 to life. And so, but I count myself as being lucky, being very blessed. I had a grandmother who stepped in my life, taught me very early in life responsibility. She taught me the values of self-reliance, independence, but she also taught me how to love, how to forgive, and how to pray. And those things have been a big part of my life. So I've forgiven my father a long time ago. Those burdens are not my burdens to carry. I certainly have appreciated the American values that I grew up with, strong American values that actually were consistent throughout our country. At one point, you know, whether you grew up in South, North, East, or West, there were American principles that we all believed in. We all believed in. And those principles line up well with the conservative party for me, the Republican Party. I served in the United States Navy, Navy vet, who couldn't swim initially. So I learned how to swim actually in the Navy. I won't be doing any synchronized swimming, though. But I served in the Navy. After completing my active duty military service, I entered a career in law enforcement, where I served for close to over 20 years, and very, very happy about my service to our nation and to our state. Very fortunate and blessed to have that honor.
So what did you do in your police career?
Well, early on, I was a correction officer. I moved from correction officer to more traditional policing, specialized policing at state liquor enforcement. And there I had the opportunity to develop a strong knowledge of substance use disorder, things that go along with that, from drugs to alcohol, tobacco, all of that full range of activity there. I also served as our state's chief administrative alcohol prosecutor. I also prosecuted cases in district court, circuit courts now, but district court.
So what does alcohol prosecution mean?
Well, so there are violations of alcohol laws in the state pertaining to operators who hold liquor licenses.
Oh,
I prosecuted those
okay.
cases, right? I prosecuted those cases on an administrative level. And that was one of my tasks as well. So my law enforcement career took me in many different directions. At one point, I was certified as a firearms instructor at the police academy. In fact, it's the medal I received in the military, the Navy, for expert pistol shot. And so in
45?
Yes, yes. So when I was in the Navy, in policing, I was a firearms instructor. I taught defensive tactics, identity theft, fake IDs at the police academy, whole host of different disciplines. Moving there, as I said, focusing on substance use disorder, DWIs, drug recognition expert, instructor, training other police officers, developing a skill set of how to disperse large parties and things like that. Moving on to actually writing legislation. Now, I've never sponsored legislation, but I wrote legislation for over 10 years.
Wow.
Actually wrote regulations
No kidding.
and prosecuted regulations. And that's why I'm a firm believer in the fact that that regulatory responsibility should be transferred back to the legislative body, not the administrative agencies. And that's what our founders believed in. You know, three equal branches of government, and in the administrative branch of government, you have all three rolled up into one. And having that experience and understanding the complexities that's associated with that, I think the real transparency of regulatory environment needs to be transferred back to the legislative body.
I don't think you're alone in that view. I mean, you hear all the time about the bureaucracy in Washington.
Right.
And,
And that started actually with Congress, you know, when they created the Administrative Procedures Act. And most people don't talk about this, but the vast majority of citizens in this country will never see the inside of a courtroom, the judicial branch. The vast majority of citizens in this country will never speak to an elected official. Not so true here in New Hampshire, but the vast majority of citizens will not. The vast majority of citizens will never speak to the president or the governor of their states. But every single citizen in this country, regardless of your station in this country, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your age, you will come in contact with an administrative branch of government. And it's the part of government you have the least control over. Exactly. It's the part of government you fear the most. I'm sure you and many others have heard the term, heard the phrase, yeah, you don't want to do that. You don't want to upset them. You don't want to push them because your paperwork may get lost. They may delay you, things like that. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some great public employees out there who do a tremendous job. I work with many great public employees. But the structure is what I'm speaking of. I'm not speaking about the personalities involved. I'm speaking about the structure. The structure has to be changed. The structure should go back to the original intent of our Constitution.
I agree with you. I see on the news pretty much every day things that are being done administratively that really should have been legislated by Congress.
It happens all the time. But this is one of the things I learned being in my role in law enforcement. And this is the uniqueness of my responsibilities I've had over my years in law enforcement. I got a front row seat to some of these things that we deal with. And it's easy for legislators to really appreciate the administrative branch of government. Because if you're a legislator, it gives you two bites at the apple in terms of, particularly in Congress. You can campaign on the fact that we have to do something about regulations, we have to control this. And you can actually legislate and blame the administrative agency. If you go back to the IRS, when they were found to have been running investigations against Tea Party conservatives, there was really no consequences to that action. I mean, sure, Congress felt great by calling in the employees of that agency and kind of chastising them publicly, but there was no real consequences.
No,
for
they're
that.
still working there.
Right, sure. So Congress can say, "Hey, listen, I'm fighting for you. I'm holding these folks accountable." But the system never changes. You know, it's sort of like when. And don't get me wrong. I think our president and our governor are doing a great job of really tackling the regulatory process from the current structure. But what I'm talking about is really changing that structure to put it back in line where it used to be, and because it makes more sense there. Legislators, the people you elect, should be writing legislation and the rules to accompany them. But they'll tell you the system is too massive, too complex, and the legislators do not have the depth of knowledge necessary to write the rules to accompany the legislation they just wrote. So that's what they will tell you. But I don't believe that. I believe you would have less government intrusion into our lives if they had that task of also writing the rules that follow the legislation, because it would give them an incentive to write less laws. Right now, the process is that if you take, for every one new rule that's written, okay, we're going to take 20 away. However, the person deciding which rules to give up are the same people who write the rules, right? So I think we have to get back to a place where it makes sense for the legislators, the citizens, to be directly involved in that process. You'll find that currently at the federal level, for every law written, there are 18 rules written. And the best example of this is the ACA, commonly referred to as Obamacare. I think there were over 350,000 words used to write the law. Over 11 million words were used on the regulations to manage the law that was written. And most folks aren't ever going to read that body
Of course not.
regulation, nor will your elected officials read that body of regulations that's been written. And so what you've done is turned over management of our lives to the administrative branch of government. And to me, that's why I find it the most offensive, because the one thing that our state believes in very deeply is freedom and liberty. And when the government can manage your health, we're in trouble. And I think far too often we've created a system where people believe that government should be involved. I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think there are certain things government should be involved in, particularly third-party interests, protecting you from me. If you haven't freely entered a marketplace and I'm causing you harm, then the government has a role there. The government has no role between you and I. If I want to sell you something, you want to buy something from me. The best example is Uber. I mean, I don't think you get a better example than Uber, where you have a situation where people can be pro-enterprise. If I have a car insurance, I can become my own boss, so to speak. I can pick you up, I can drop you off, you can purchase my services. Very little need for government intrusion. But you see government involvement,
Right.
because government wants to regulate Uber like it regulated the taxi industry. And there's a support for that, because if you're currently in the taxi industry, you want this free market to have be subject to the same rules and regulations you've been subject to, rather than people saying, let's take off the regulations in this entire industry because they're not necessary. Yeah.
And, you know, I can't disagree with you at all on any of that.
Yeah.
I agree as far as the administration goes and everything else like that. There's not much doubt about that. You look at the ACA, all I read about in the news, and I'm no expert on that,
Yeah.
is you see 15, 25% increases on premiums every year.
Sure.
You know, so I know people that won't buy it
Well,
because they can't afford it.
Well, think of this, right? We've moved to a place where the government can actually say to you, if you do not buy something, a product, you will be penalized for not buying that product. And it's sold as, well, if you don't buy, someone else is picking up your cost. And we all get that dynamic. We all get that dynamic. But there's better ways to address this issue.
Okay, so what's the better way?
The most effective way is to, number one, reveal the price of your product, right? So if you hide the price from me, we would not allow that to take place anyplace else. I mean, you wouldn't do business with anyone else if they wouldn't give you the price before you had the service. And so that's one way. It's just opening up the pricing. Number two, you should be allowed to shop any way you want to buy your product.
I've said this for years. The first thing they should have done is allow you to buy across state lines.
It makes perfect sense, because if you take great care of yourself and you do what's responsible and right for you, the insurance company has a right to manage its risk. You have a right to shop around and try to get the best services you can possibly find. If that service is in another state, so be it. If that service is provided by another carrier, so be it.
And what happens when competition shows up?
Prices go down.
Prices go down,
Right.
yes.
And this is what I mean by the free market. Very few people, I find, when you have a conversation with them, truly understand what free market really means. I find that very few people truly understand what it means to allow to be pro-enterprise. I find that most people believe that government must necessitate the process by which we move. Government must be involved, because if government is not involved in that process, then somehow someone's losing out, right? And this is this notion of fairness, right, as opposed to freedom. If you have maximum freedom, you're going to do what's in your interest, what's in your family's interest, what's in your community's interest. When it comes to fairness, who decides what's fair? What's fair to you may be very different for me, what I believe is to be fair. But if you and I both have freedom, then it's up to us. We make the choices. And so if I can buy my insurance, let's say in Texas, maybe Texas is doing something wonderful, the companies there offer a better plan. Why can't I buy my insurance in Texas? I think those are the type of things that produces lower prices, because now people are fighting for your
Well, if most
service.
people buy their insurance in Texas, the other company's going to say, uh-oh, why?
Right.
Their prices are lower. We have to lower ours,
Right.
or
Right.
else we're going to lose business.
More services. I mean, X-rays. You get so many different prices from X-rays. If you're paying cash, if you're insurance, if you go to one hospital provider to another provider, you're getting different places. And why can't more people open up services around the state? I get the arguments why it wouldn't work, but all those arguments are against the free market. And most people will tell you, I support the free market. Most people will tell you that for themselves, not for their competitors. Right? So everyone wants government involvement when it hurts or harms the other guy or girl who's trying to get into business. But when it's into their favor, they're all for government involvement. And so I think we have to be honest about that process. We want government to do something about the other person, not me. You know, the services I'm providing, what I'm doing, makes perfect sense, and you should absolutely support my program. But the other lady or gentleman, no, we need regulations on that. We need to curtail that type of behavior. I mean, that's if you really talk to people, this is what it comes down to. People want a competitive edge. I understand that. But you have to make your own competitive edge. We're not going to use government as a leverage point for you to create a competitive edge. This is what keeps smaller businesses from starting, from competing effectively. If you look at, I've spoken to a number of facilities in nursing care. In fact, when I was a young man, I worked at a nursing home as well. Worked in the dietary department. And I've spoken to a number of people in this industry, and their challenge was just completing paperwork, finding an employee who can fill out forms and comply with the regulations that have been created. So if you're a smaller entity, you don't have the resources to hire a specialist to comply. But if I'm a larger, more complex operation, of course, I can hire people. And this is a way to eliminate competition. Regulations do more harm than they help at the end of the day. Now, that's not to say that we don't need some sensible laws.
Of course.
It's not to say that we don't need some sensible rules. My problem is who's writing those rules. As someone who's had to write those rules, and I can tell you that belongs to the legislative body. I remember once testifying before a House committee, suggesting that, you know, the easiest thing to do is take away the rulemaking authority from me. I mean, number one, it was no easy task of writing rules, number one. Number two, it's not really my responsibility. It wasn't my responsibility as an administrative person to write rules, but that's the law that's been passed. You write the rules. You know it better. We're not going to manage an agency. Okay, well, that's what the Constitution set up for, right, to have a balanced government. The executive branch is supposed to carry out the laws and rules that are passed by the legislative body. And so I think we get back to a place where you have people who have not been elected.
Right. And
they may be well-intentioned people. They may be good people. I think I was a good person. I think I am a good person. And I think the authority, though, rests, in my opinion, as someone who's experienced that, rests with the legislative body. I think you have control over your legislators. You do not have control over your administrative branch of government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're right. So now let's get to why you decided to run for
sure.
Congress.
Much of the reasons we've been speaking of. I think if you really love our country, you really believe in the principles of our nation, and you've seen what I've seen in government, I think it motivates you to continue that service in a way that gives back. And for me, I love our country, I love our state, and the same reason I joined the United States Navy, same reason I became a police officer, I want to give back to my community in a way that has helped me. I've been very blessed in my life because I had a strong person in my life, my grandmother, as I said earlier. And for me, service is about public service. Public service is about giving back. It's not about taking. And when you take more than you're giving, I think you have to question yourself, right? And so for me, I certainly want to give back much more than I've taken. And I've been very blessed in my life, as I said earlier. And this is a process for me to continue that service. I certainly believe in term limits. I understand that some people do not believe in that process. I just think that term limits are necessary because if you look and we see John Conyers, my best example. Here's someone who was elected in 1964, left office in 2017 because of sexual conduct allegations. So in Congress for over 50 years. Please tell me who's that wonderful. I've never met any individual in life. I've met a lot of amazing people in my life. Been touched by a lot of amazing people in my life who helped guide me to become the man I am today, men and women. But I would submit to you, I've never met one who's that wonderful. They need to be in a legislative body for 50 years, passing laws that they really.
I think there's a lot of citizens in the United States that would agree with you that there should be term limits. Unfortunately, the only people that can pass term limits are the ones that have a vested interest in staying.
Sure, and that's why you can never. I think, and so, as someone who's written policy myself, I don't think you could go with the notion that folks who've already been there, now your time is over. I think you have to write it going forward. So, and I think it's hard. People are hard pressed to suggest that anyone elected at 2018 and beyond, you're subject to term limits. Very difficult for a sitting congressperson.
You couldn't just clean everybody out.
Very different for a sitting Congress member of the Senate, of the House, to suggest that they're not going to vote for such legislation because it doesn't impact you. It impacts future legislation, elections. So those folks who are elected after that will have term limits. Those folks who are elected after 2018, the pension plans will go away. The benefits will go away. As we were talking earlier, you and I and many of our fellow citizens are experiencing an increase in our premiums. While Congress will tell you that they're on the ACA as well. However, over 70% of their health care is paid for by you and I.
Yes, it is.
Right? So if your health care is being subsidized to that level, it's really disingenuous for you to say you're on the ACA. That's number one. Number two, I think you really have to look at the benefits. And you have a hard argument to go back to your constituents and say to them, no, we need to maintain this system. We need to maintain these retirement plans, these medical benefit plans, and we need to maintain non-term limits for elected officials. I think if FDR, after he completed 12 years at the president level, we decided we needed term limits on the president. Now imagine a world where you didn't have term limits on the president, right? So it's happened once in our nation. It can happen again. I think citizens deserve a turnover in elected officials. It's never been designed to be a profession.
Exactly.
It's designed to be service. And if you understand service, you understand that's a replacement value to service. When I was in the military, law enforcement, you train someone to take your spot. That's your first obligation when you get promoted, is to train somebody to take over. That's the first obligation. Because if you should fall, the mission has to be completed. Congress is not interested in changing seats, giving up their seats. They're interested in maintaining their seats. So their entire thought process is maintaining their seats. If you knew you were there for a limited time and you had to get the work done, you're much more inclined to do what's right.
Yes.
Because we train politicians actually not to take risks. We tell them, okay, don't do this, don't upset this person, don't upset this person. So you get politicians talking out both sides of their mouth, trying to play both sides of the fences. And I think that's what is most upsetting to the average citizen, most upsetting to me.
Yeah, and even on the local level here, it's always been a philosophy of mine that you should always be training your replacement. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
Of course, of course. I mean, that's what people would expect. But when people wait and they say, okay, and I'm sure you've heard this process too, we'll wait till after the primary. Well, I say to people all the time, you have to get involved. You have to get involved early, and the reason you have to get involved early is because you have to pick your horse you want in the starting gate, because it reflects the values of our state, of our community, of our district in this case, and of our party, the Republican Party for me. And so I think it's important that people know who's asking for their vote, who's asking to represent them. I think it's important to support one of those candidates. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, that's how you have your voice, so you can make sure that person is doing what you want them to do. That's how you get control of government. But also those folks, like I was speaking earlier about the Administrative Procedures Act, for instance. There's a couple of legislators in Congress right now, I think they started in 2005 working on this issue. But you hear very little talk about it because most people aren't interested in you as a citizen knowing where your true power, where the true power of government lies. The true power of government lies in the administrative branch of government. And most folks who are in Congress aren't interested in you finding out about that because that makes their jobs a lot harder.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll demand more accountability from them. And I believe that if we elect the right people, and when I mean the right people who have a strong sense of character, because if you have a strong sense of character, you have a strong sense of service, you're more likely to do the right thing. Now, I think if you are in an environment where there's chaos and collusion and corruption, if you stay in that environment too long, two things will happen to you. You'll fight even harder or lose your mind, or you'll give into it. And this is why I believe interim limits must exist, because at some point we have to get back to a place where we have a government of the people, right? And the only way you get that is if you actually have people running your government,
Mm-hmm.
not machines. And what I mean by machines, not the process by which people are just being elected over and over again by the same metrics and doing the same things year after year after year.
Well, from what you've just said today, it appears to me that you have an incredible amount of experience with substance abuse and the opioid crisis. Do you have any thoughts on how you might address that issue as a congressman?
Oh, sure. I think we have to be honest about where this originated from, right? I think some of the studies I've seen and read suggest that 75 to 80% of those first-time heroin users started with a prescription opiate. I can tell you, as someone who was in law enforcement, who was training other law enforcement officers, I remember some of our training as a DRE when we were bringing in new students, law enforcement officers. We would do some of our training in Lowell or Lawrence and places like that. And we were seeing a lot of prescription drug use at that time. I mean, this goes back a number of years, 2005, 6, 7. Around there, we were seeing some of this prescription drug coming through those testing, because we were doing testing on actual people who have been taking an actual substance, and most of that was prescription drugs. And so I think you have to go back and realize that New Hampshire was a place where you have 1.3 million people, and so how is it possible that I think we had the third largest impact of opiates in the country? And I don't believe that's per capita, but that's just raw numbers. And so we're one of the smallest states in the country, but we have one of the biggest problems in the country. And so when you look at some of the abuses that happen around our state, you look at some of the prosecutions that have taken place in our state around this issue. So that some of this originated in the pharmaceutical industry. Doing research on medicine and finding new medicines is a good thing because it benefits our country. But the abuse of anything becomes a problem. And when you have, I think more and more reports are coming out now, some of the salespeople in the pharmaceutical industry, the tactics they use with doctors' offices is like that to provide prescription opiates. I can tell you my wife just went through a process where they gave her a pretty good supply of opiates. We requested a pain blocker during her surgery, so she took prescription opiates for 1 day and then switched to Tylenol and ibuprofen. So there's plenty of different ways that, if you're educated in this area, that you can prevent yourself from becoming hooked on some of these prescription opiates, which, because we tighten up our prescription drug monitoring program, of course, people turn now to the illicit form of the same opiate and heroin. And so now we move from a medical problem to a legal problem. So now it requires law enforcement, requires the medical industry working together to resolve this problem. But who picks up the cost? Who picks up the enormous cost associated with this? Right now, you and I are picking up this cost as taxpayers. You and I are picking up this cost. And I think that's when you have to turn back, as a free market person, you turn back to the person who helped create this problem say, okay, this is part of your doing. You have to pay some of the cost here. To me, that makes perfect sense. And clearly, we want to prevent this from happening. So we have to reach young people as soon as possible to educate them about the risk of substance use disorder. Also, we have to educate people along the way in terms of how they use medicine. I mean, you know, if you think about it, we actually sell sickness to people in this country. You know, there's a pill for almost anything that ails you, right? So there's something for it. And now, before, you could not advertise on television directly from a manufacturer to a patient. You have to go to the doctor. You know, you market it and sell your medicine to doctors to give it to their patients because they have an interest there. And so you start to see this whole collapsing system around us where there's an interest in consumers being directly communicated to. And as a consumer, if you advertising works, right? That's why they use it. So you educate the consumer about your product. The consumer goes to the doctor, I'd like to try that. I'd like to try that. And then you have doctors also pushing some of the samples that they've been given by the pharmaceutical companies. So I think we have to look at how we created this problem. You know, as someone who, as I said to you earlier, who grew up in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, I'm used to having a front row seat when people are hooked on drugs. I saw my father go through that, and many other people in my family suffered that. But I also saw illicit drug use and selling on the streets. And that was a very different process than what we're facing currently now with the opioid crisis. And we're calling it a crisis because it was created. It was created. I mean, you know, New Hampshire is a wonderful place. I've been here for, as I said, over 30 years. And when I first came here, you know, people didn't lock their doors. And I'm not joking about exaggerating that. I was one of those people who didn't lock my doors. I mean, this was a very different environment for me as someone who came from a very different violent drug environment. You come into New Hampshire, the people here were different. Their value system was different in terms of how they respected the community. Now, those same values I grew up with my grandmother, I tell you about, they were here in New Hampshire as well, but the community was different here. And you didn't see the level of violence and drug misuse in the state 30 years ago. You didn't see that. And so you have to ask yourself, where did it come from? Did parents in New Hampshire certainly break down and start raising their children differently over a 30-year period? No. I mean, we have to be honest about how we, New Hampshire here, how we got to an opiate problem. And I don't think we've been very honest about that.
No, and frankly, I was shocked to find out how big the opioid crisis is in New Hampshire, and for the life of me, I cannot figure out why.
Well, again, if you start with the process, what the data shows that a lot of these people started with a legal prescription, and if you become hooked on a legal prescription, when that is shut off, where do you go? These are very difficult things for people to overcome on their own. They are, whether we like it or not. Drugs do a couple things to your body, right? They speed it up, slow it down, or confuse it. And when you have become dependent upon this type of medicine, you need it, you crave it. And if you talk to folks like I have, who are actual heroin users, crack users, they're looking for a place to relieve their pain, their tension. They want this, you know, and they'll seek it. They'll seek it, and so you can't get it legally, so you turn to the streets. And so now that becomes another problem. And of course, when there's demand, someone will supply. And so that's why we have to do all we can to keep that from coming into our country, certainly coming into our state. So now we've created many different challenges because we broke down a process that was in place before. So when you break down a process, and I know there will be those who say, okay, this is why you need regulations. That's not why you need regulations, because regulations help create some of this problem, right? So what we need is to go back to the fundamental values that we've had in this nation for a very, very long time. We need to empower moms and dads to feel good about their parenting, to make sure that there's an environment that is not destructive to that family environment, but is appreciative of that family environment. We need to go back to a place where people are actually held accountable for what they've done or haven't done. And we walked away from that. You know, it's very difficult to tell a young person or hold a young person accountable when they look around them and every adult,
Is doing the same thing.
and I shouldn't say every adult, that's an absolute term, which is not fair, but the vast majority, of a great number of adults are not behaving in a way that brings or enlightenment or encouragement or guidance to those young people. So you see why young people are angry. You see why there's a great degree of mistrust. This is if you think about these young people, we're passing on enormous debt to them,
Oh, yes.
to our great-grandchildren. It won't be our children or our grandchildren, it'll be our great-grandchildren paying for this debt. You look at what we've told them about different choices they make in their life. And what they see are adults who behaved in many cases irresponsibly, very selfishly. And so if you're a young person, you're struggling with this because, like you, and I'm sure I certainly did, I keep leaning back on my grandmother because this was a woman who was strong in my life. My grandfather's as well, but who was very strong in my life, a very strong force in my life. And she behaved, in my estimation, as an adult. She didn't participate in the same music I listened to, the same clothing I wore. She was an adult. She taught me wrong from right, and she demanded that early in my life. And that I didn't like it when I was young. I'm not going to pretend that I grew up actually liking that level of parental control that I had with my grandmother when I lived with her. But it served me well, and you don't realize that until you get a little older, just how important those lessons are. But if you have responsible adults in your life, they know the value of that. They know you're not going to be pleased with them over time. That's why parenting is the most difficult job we have in this country, because it requires you to remove emotion and do what's right. For a young person, it's very difficult for parents to remove emotion because that's something you love, that's part of you, and it's not an easy job. And that's why I don't really judge parents harshly, because all parents go through a process in their own way. But I think if we could bag government out of that so much guiding and trying to manage families, I think most parents would step up to the plate. But when they've been told by government you don't really need to through policy or through regulation, then they step back. They haven't been directly told that, but through your policies, through our regulations, we kind of give that message very clearly. This is a government responsibility, not a parental responsibility. And we rob parents of that ultimate responsibility of loving and protecting their young person. Yeah.
I agree with you there. So let's talk about something I and most Americans consider that's very important. I've seen polls on it, and the number one issue that Americans are concerned with isn't North Korea. It's the economy.
Of course.
And how do you feel about the trade situation with the tariffs?
Well, let me say first, I think our economy is really going well. We have record low unemployment for women, record low unemployment for blacks and Latinos in our country. So the president's policies, things he's been advocating for, are actually working. On the tariff side, I think we all support free trade. The president supports free trade. Every single person I've met and talked to as I traveled the district, business people, spoke to a person right here in Londonderry who uses steel. They're supportive of the president. Now, we can have a conversation or a debate about the approach, about the tactic, but at the end of the day, I think our president and most business people I've spoken to, myself, I'm sure you do, we all support free trade.
Exactly.
But a part of free trade is being fair
Yes.
to America. And as I said before, who's dictating what's fair, right? So if China is dictating to America what's fair, well, they're dictating what's fair from their perspective. We just haven't had someone to stand up for America in a very long time. In a very long time, as a chief executive officer for our country. And so now you have a person who says, I'm willing to fight for America. It's going to be a little painful, a little rocky.
It will.
But I'm willing to fight for America, because at some point, we're going to have to do this. If you can engage in business in America very freely, because we really believe in that free trade, that open market atmosphere that we're trying to create here. But when we're doing trade deals that give us the short end of the stick, at some point you have to ask a question, okay, is this really trade? Is this really trade, or we've just been taken advantage of? Now, business owners in our country, particularly in our state, very, very creative people, very innovative people. They'll figure out a way to make a living, to create growth in that system. But that doesn't mean that system has been set up to really benefit free trade. It's folks trying to make a living given the system before them, and they have to make it work. That's what business people do. They figure out a way to get it done to provide for their employees, their families, and their communities. So I commend them for doing that. But I also commend our president for trying to figure out a way to bring this back to some order.
Level playing field.
Right, and you see that there are many people who agree with his approach to saying this trade issue is out of balance. I disagree with what he's doing, but it's always easy to blame the person who's coming up with some idea, some way of trying to achieve the goal. What's the other solution? Now, some people have suggested, why don't we go to let's go back to the rest of the world and ask those folks to get involved. This is America. We represent 6% of the world's population, and 94% of the world's population depends on us. They depend on us economically, they depend on us militarily. So you start to ask yourself, will we continue to be the world's police? Will we continue to be the world's piggy bank? At some point, we cannot sustain that.
Right.
We cannot continue to send our babies all over the globe to protect other nations and their citizens without those nations and citizens paying for our services. We cannot continue to provide direct foreign aid without recouping some of our loss and cost here. I mean, if you really think about it, we have close to 800 military installations around the globe in 70
Wow.
countries. In 70 countries. And I think last I looked, there was a tune of $150 billion we spend on maintaining those protections around the globe. Some are in our interests, some are not. Some are in our allies' interests, and I get that as well. But America has to be compensated at some level for providing these services. America has to be protected here at home, and if we destroy our home in defense of trying to make every other country viable, trying to protect every other country, what would be left for our kids, our children, our grandchildren? And I think we need someone who is thoughtful about Americans. And I think this president is a patriot. He's someone who wants to stand up for America, and that patriotism resonates with all of us. If you look at his voting demographics, they drew in from all over the place. They drew people who have given up on voting, given up on politics, because he spoke to them in a way that says, I'm with you, I'm an American. Let's put America first. That's not an isolation statement. It's not wrong. Because if you're on an airline, the best way to describe this, and I've heard it described this way before, and you probably have as well. If you're on an airline and the oxygen mask drop down first, you put yours on first before you can help me. Helping me without yours on, and you somehow succumb to something, you haven't helped me at all. No, we're both gone.
That's, that's exactly the philosophy that emergency responders use.
Right.
You don't throw away a life to try and save a life.
Right. Right.
You have to be alive to rescue somebody first.
Right. America has to stand, or no one benefits. And so at some point, we've had executive leaders before who've given us lip service, who told us the wonderful things they will do for the country and how they were going to make sure America was respected, America was protected, and it hasn't worked out that way. It hasn't worked out that way at all, because we have seen the results of those policies. And they have not always been in our favor. Now we have a president who is fighting for what's in our favor. And I understand. I understand if you're a business person and you see this coming, this is unnerving to you. You're not easy about it because it could cost you.
I think that's what is very disconcerting for a lot of people in Washington, is you actually have a business entrepreneur that's come up from nothing, started his own businesses and everything. And when you're in business and you have a product, either you sell it or you go down the tubes.
Right.
It's all on your head. And I'm not sure Washington was ready for a business entrepreneur's approach.
Well, here's what I'm sure Washington wasn't prepared for, because we've had many business people run for office. right? A lot of business people run for office. A lot of people in the Congress are business people themselves. What we haven't had is a business person who understood government, right? Most business people do not understand government. They understand their business, they understand the laws or regulations around their business,
Right.
but they don't understand the process of government. So here you have a president who comes in who has been a successful entrepreneur, but also someone who understands government, who says, "Listen, I know how this works, and I can make some of these changes happen with resistance from the Democrats and some moderate to very little support from the Republicans. I can make some of these things work." And without the knowledge of how government operates, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that the president, or like any other human being, has full knowledge of every single aspect of government. But you understand how the big moving pieces work. That's why some of these things are done. But what they try to hit the president on are the nuances, right? The nuances to try to make it appear that he doesn't have the knowledge necessary to manage government. And I would submit to you that's why he's been successful, because he understands the big moving pieces of government. None of us have full knowledge of every single program or department in government. But it's wise and important that you understand the moving parts of government. And I think that he does understand. And I think that's why you're seeing the support that our president continues to receive, because millions of us in this country have always wanted a president who was willing to stand up and take some of the blows so that America could benefit, America's families could benefit. It's not easy changing a culture. Once you created a culture of dependency like we created since the 1960s, and you've been telling people they're victims, and you created this enormous burden of dependency and growth of government and cost and debt in government, it's not easy changing that. No one is willing to give up what they have acquired, right? Bureaucracy is nothing, right? So if you have benefited from this structure, you love this structure. You're not willing to let it go. But that doesn't mean that's the right way to do business. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very difficult for folks to actually acknowledge that. You don't want to acknowledge that. I mean, if you look at and I use this as an example because it's very true. If you look at the first 100 years after slavery for blacks in this country, look at the growth. Look at the growth when government laws were sanctioned against the interests of blacks in this country. But because we had a true free market system, they were able to survive even despite government sanctioned laws, because the market was truly free. And that's why you have someone like Madam C.J. Walker, who became the first female millionaire in this country, a black woman, who was born 2 years after slavery. And I think in 1905 or 1910, she became a millionaire in this country because of a free market system with very little government intrusion, even despite government having laws that purposely try to prevent success. And I think if anybody actually looked at our history and understands what happened in our country, you'd realize that starting in the 1960s with the Great Society, this is when we began to move away from families, those values I was talking to you earlier about families, and we created this notion of dependency and government necessity, and it's been hard to break it ever since. It's been hard to get people to move away from that. Now you have a president who steps forward, who's trying to break that up. And if you look at, again, you look at unemployment. Here's the best example of this, right? When the president announced back at the State of the Union, he talked about the black unemployment rate in this country, the Latino unemployment rate in this country, and the female unemployment rate in this country. You notice that many on the left, particularly the Black caucus, very few stood up and applauded. Now, if you have dedicated your life, as many have on the left, and particularly in the Black caucus and some others, said, I'm fighting for the minorities, I'm fighting for the underprivileged, I'm fighting for the poor, and someone tells you that we have record low unemployment for those folks you've been fighting so hard for, why wouldn't you stand and acknowledge that with pride? You don't have to like the messenger, but if that's your goal and your goal is being achieved, why wouldn't you acknowledge that? You want to acknowledge that because you want to get credit for it, and in order for you to stay in office, you need something to run on. And so I have to keep you in that box. Here comes a guy who says, listen, get outside the box. Make all you can. Become an entrepreneur. you don't need to depend on government. Do what you can. And so that's frightening to people who have used that as a wedge issue to get elected. If you've been elected based upon the divisive issues in our country, and someone is solving those issues, solving those problems, that's very threatening to your viability as a candidate or as a member of Congress. There's a difference between people who can identify problems and people who can solve problems, and people who use problems to get elected,
Right.
never intending on solving those.
Well, you hit things right on the head. So let's talk about one of the biggest things,
Sure.
DACA and immigration.
Right. Well, for me, again, this is a mess that's been created by prior administrations, the failure of Congress, and now you have a president who's trying to address that. Every single problem that the president has faced has always been there. He's just really trying to find a solution. He's not trying to give you lip service and give you a song and dance about it. He's looking for a solution. And so now people, many of the things you notice that he's being blamed for, there's always been used. This has always been the law. Now people are concerned. America's the most generous nation on earth. There's not another country as generous as America. I think the count is over 1 million people who are entered into the country legally every year. Every year. Nearly the population of New Hampshire is permitted into the country every year. So at some point, you have to ask yourself, how long are we going to maintain two to three types of immigration systems? The legal one, the process that takes many years, many challenges to that process to become a U.S. citizen, or the one that says that I'm going to show up on your doorsteps asking for asylum, or the one that says I'll just get into the country and you'll create a program for me. That's not fair to the folks, and I can tell you, I've spoken to many people in our district, in our state, who are naturalized citizens, who went through the process, who have been here, second generation of folks. We appreciate immigration. In fact, the 14th Amendment, authored by the Republican Party, established citizenship in this country. Without the Republican Party and the due process of citizenship, the right to citizenship, this would not be possible. So conservatives, the Republican Party, we've always believed in immigration and supported that process and citizenship. This is not a party that's anti-immigrant or anti-immigration. I mean, that's a silly notion, but that's what people have you believe when they want political points. The fact of the matter is, we should all be concerned when we have created a welfare state that encourages people to come here illegally. So when your government says that we guarantee by our policies housing, food, shelter, clothing, medical care, why wouldn't you come if it's better than the place that you are? And we understand that people have come always seeking a better life, encouraging themselves. And we support that as a nation. But we cannot support illegal immigration. We cannot support the violation of law. We are a country of laws so that we don't serve at the whim of men and women. And so the laws have to mean something, because if we start cherry picking which laws we will enforce and which laws we will not enforce, then we're all in trouble. And you start to see that across the spectrum. Someone will tell you it's wrong to enforce your immigration laws because it's horrible. It's horrible. You're separating children from their parents. You're denying people an opportunity. There's any level of excuses to not enforce the law. And now you're seeing folks on the left advocating to remove ICE. They want to disband ICE. And you see this across the board when it comes to enforcement, right? This is why it's interesting. People's true colors always emerge when you can tell where they are, particularly elected officials at the national level. They'll use this issue or any other issue to be elected. So now they're all, in fact, our two congressional folks here in New Hampshire decided to vote, I believe they voted present when they were voting on whether they should eliminate ICE. They voted present. Now, you either support it or you don't. I find it interesting that people are not supportive. We have federal elected officials who are not supportive of us protecting the border. It's really shocking that you've been elected to stand up for our Constitution, and you go to Washington, and your first step is, how could I maintain my seat here in Washington? I see there's an issue that's bubbling up. We can use that against the Republican Party, or I can use that against my opponent. So guess what? I'm going to make this an issue. We shouldn't support ICE, who's protecting our border. We should get rid of this type of enforcement. And I think when we begin to cherry pick which laws we enforce in our country, we do a disservice to law itself. We do a disservice to our founding principles, because at that point, you do have a government that cherry picks, depending upon who's in power, which laws will be enforced and which laws will not be enforced. And I can tell you, as someone who's a law enforcement officer, that's one of the greatest challenges, and that's one of the greatest criticisms of law enforcement. You're enforcing the law. Well, if you're enforcing the law fairly, if you're enforcing the law consistently, that's what is expected based upon our Constitution. If the law is not desirable, if the law is unnecessary, then you remove the law, you change the law. That's a process that we have in this country, and that's what we should do.
Surprisingly enough, years ago, I did a camera shoot with Bill Richardson, former governor of New Mexico, at a local house when he was, a candidate. And I had a chance to talk with him. And I asked him, I says, well, Bill, what do you think about immigration? And he says, I have a simple solution. Number one, identify them. Number two, get rid of the criminals. Number three, put them on a multi-year path to citizenship. And I'm saying, what's so difficult about that?
Well, it's not difficult. I think trying to figure out how to get them on a multi-year path to citizenship, what does that mean? Does that mean that they work here for a short period of time on a visa program, they return back to their country, they reunite with their family, they come back on as long as they haven't been involved in any criminal activity, that process. There's many different ways we can solve this, but before we get to that, the details of it, we have to look at the thought process of American elected officials who are in Washington who refuse to address this problem. This is not a problem created by the president. This is a problem created by Congress. I mean, the fact that you have 535 people who can't agree on securing the border, it is numbing,
Well,
mind-numbing.
What's even more mind-numbing? We'll probably never know how many terrorists ICE has prevented from entering the United States, the intelligence community, a lot of that stuff. I, as a citizen, I'll never know that.
Of course not.
But I'm sure it happens all the time.
It happens daily, and that's one of the hardest things to prove, because people will take one case, two cases, and exaggerate those and try to justify removal of ICE. And I just, again, I go back to your mentality of the person you're sending to Congress. Your job is to protect the Constitution of this country. Your job is to protect the citizens of this country. And we should all have universal agreement that America has a right to secure his border, like any other nation.
Of course they do.
And we have that same right. And the fact that we have federal elected officials who are so desperate to maintain their seat, they're willing to sell out this country, to harm this country in order to maintain their power. And that's what's offensive to, I think, all voters, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, liberal. I think the average voter out there is sick and tired of people who are doing what's in their interests. And again, I go back to the only way you restore power back to the people of this country is that you limit the people who are there, how long they can be there, and you look at the character of the person who's going there. I mean, we can examine policies all day long, and you'll have policy discussions over and over and over again. And by some of the mess that the president and the current Congress, well, the president's dealing with the lack that is being dealt with in Congress right now, tells you that these will always be issues until you change the type of people who are there. And I think those two things along, focusing on the type of person you're sending there, limiting the amount of time they can be there, really starts to restore the trust that's necessary. uh, uh, for the citizens of this country. Because every single problem that we're talking about today has always been there. And every single person running for office says, send me, I'll change it, I'll clean it up. What I've asked people to do, send me so that I can put term limits in place for folks who are elected after 18 moving forward, address the Administrative Procedures Act so that we can start to hold Congress accountable for their lawmaking and their rulemaking, and limit my time there. Because I'm not that special, no one's that special who deserves to be in Congress repeatedly. The moment you start believing your freedom, your liberty rests in one person, you've already started to give it away. We all must work to maintain our freedom and liberty. We all must work towards that end. And we do that by having people serve for a limited time, coming home without the benefits, without the pensions, but serve your country, not take from your country. Yeah.
Great. Now, is
Thank you.
there anything else you can think of that
Oh,
you would
absolutely.
like to speak about?
Absolutely. September 11th is primary day.
Of course.
September 11th is primary day. I'm hoping that folks will get out and vote. I'm hoping that I can earn their trust and support to represent our party in the fall against a Democratic opponent. And I'm hoping that November 6th I'll have their trust and support, and they'll send me to Congress. So that's September 11th. I need that vote. Please go to my website, Edwards4NH, Edwards, F-O-R-N-H.com. Check out my platform there. You can visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And I'm hoping that I give out my cell phone number. It's on the back of my cards, my materials, but I'll give it out here too, 603-923-7655. That's my personal cell phone. I've asked people to call me directly if they have any concerns. They want to challenge me on something they disagree with me on. I'm happy to have a conversation. So
Now,
thank you so much.
And you have a big event coming up in Portsmouth, as I understand?
Yes, Mayor Giuliani will be here August 1st to publicly endorse me and hold a fundraiser for me. So I'm pleased to have that support, because he and I have spoken in the past about community policing, something I know was important to him, certainly was important to me when I was active in law enforcement, and technology for law enforcement. But I think the community policing aspect is the most important, because I think police departments, particularly here in our state, do their very best to publicly engage the community and develop that community support, because you cannot enforce what the public will not support. So I think most
Right.
police departments really go out of their way, particularly here in New Hampshire, to gain that public trust and that public support. And so having a mayor of the largest city in our country come here to support my candidacy is an honor.
Great, and it was definitely a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good luck.
Thank you.
And as I always say at the conclusion of each show, I don't care what political persuasion you are, you have one chance to let your voice be heard in this country, whether it's local, state, or federal, and that is to exercise your right to vote. And thank you for watching.